Good afternoon. My name is Sean Daraff, and on behalf of the team here at the BC Centre for Employment Excellence.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Sorry, with technical issue here. I'd like to thank you I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our centre, it was created in 2012 with funding from the provincial and federal governments to act as a research and knowledge-sharing organization for BC employment service providers and employers. The centre's mandate is not only to do innovative research, but also to find ways to share that knowledge and best practices with BC practitioners and employers. Over the past year, we've been offering a series of research webinars as one approach to reach out and connect with practitioners across the province. Through this series, we have been highlighting new research by the centre, as well as the knowledge and expertise within the broader employment services community. You are invited to view the video recordings of previous webinars that we have posted on our website. Today, we are pleased to present part 2 of our 3-part series on understanding current employment programming and services for BC youth. Last November, the Centre issued an open call for researchers to submit proposals to explore barriers affecting BC youth employment from a variety of angles. The purpose of this call was to provide new insights and understanding into the challenges that youth are facing in the labour market, and to identify promising solutions for such issues as supporting youth who are entering the workforce or helping them find work that is a better match for their skills. Through the call, the Centre was able to support 5 projects that tackled such issues as the barriers experienced by vulnerable youth, as well as youth living with mental illness, the role that employers can play, and the promise that work placements and social enterprises hold in addressing work transitions for specific populations of youth. The research teams have completed their work, and the Centre has been publishing the papers on its website during this month of September. During the first of today's 2 presentations, Natasha Bailey will be presenting MOSAIC's research on the value of paid or unpaid work placements as a form of employment service provision for immigrant and refugee youth. I'm sure most of you are aware of the fine work that MOSAIC has been doing over the past nearly 4 decades in addressing issues that affect immigrants and refugees in the course of their settlement and integration into Canadian society. Natasha is a researcher and organizational development consultant who has been working in the nonprofit sector for 16 years. She began her career developing and facilitating personal development and pre-employment programs targeting a range of specialized populations, including single parents, newcomers, and multi-barriered women. Her most recent projects include developing quality standards frameworks for organizations that want to enhance their work with and for single parents, a national evaluation in Ireland for the outcomes of a type of adult learning which aims to foster social justice and pre-employment skills, and researching the professional career aspirations of children in a marginalized neighborhood in Dublin. In the second presentation, Annie Smith and Stephanie Martin of McCreary Centre Society will present their work on engaging diverse youth from marginalized populations across BC to identify barriers to employment and potential solutions to help inform future employment policy and services. McCreary Centre Society is a well-regarded nonprofit organization that is committed to improving the health of BC youth through community-based research, education, and youth participation projects. Annie is the Society's Executive Director, a role that she has held since 2006. She began her career as a psychiatric nurse in England before moving on to head up a not-for-profit which assisted homeless and inadequately housed youth in the deprived former mining communities of South Yorkshire. A move to Boston and a master's degree from Harvard followed, alongside 5 years working as a director of programs for people with developmental disabilities across the greater Boston area. Stephanie is the Society's Community Engagement and Communications Manager. Since 2007, she has worked with the Society to ensure that young people's voices are included in all aspects of their research, with a focus on engaging marginalized youth populations. She develops and facilitates focus groups and workshops to engage young people in research and action to inform public health policy. Now, before I turn it over to Natasha, I should note that each presentation will last approximately 25 minutes. Due to time constraints, we will hold off on answering questions until the end of each presentation. At any time during the presentations, please use the questions feature on your dashboards to submit your questions or comments, and then we will have the presenters address them during the discussion period afterwards. We are recording this webinar, and we will be posting the video on our website along with a link to the presentation slides, with further opportunities for everyone to continue the conversation with the presenters and other practitioners. And now it is my pleasure to hand it over to Natasha.
Thanks, Sean, and welcome to this presentation on a piece of research that MOSAIC did on the role and value of short-term paid or unpaid work placements for immigrant and refugee youth participating in 5 different employment programs in Vancouver. And as Sean already said, the role of MOSAIC is to empower immigrant and refugees to succeed in Canada. What I'll do is I'll just run through a bit of background about the study, the methodology, who our participants looked like, some key findings and recommendations, and what I'm going to do is try and really focus on implications for practice arising from the research. So just to give you a bit of a context about why the research was carried out, the first point there relates to a need to look at the ways in which employment services are addressing the employment barriers faced by immigrant and refugee youth, which results in that employment rate there on the slide. That amounts to about 6,790 young people between the ages of 15 and 24, a significant percentage of unemployed youth in the city, and so that's one rationale for this piece of research. I think what's interesting about this piece of research for practice is that many employment programs and practitioners are involved in setting up and acquiring work placements for young people, but not much is documented in the literature about the actual impact of those elements of employment programs. And so this piece of research was deemed relevant due to that particular rationale, to take a look at whether or not work placement works as such for this particular target group. There's also very little research about immigrant and refugee youth's awareness and experience of employment services, and some research has documented that they really don't use those services at all. So this piece of research plays a very small role in finding out what some youth thought about one aspect of employment services they experienced. Another need for this piece of research is around continuing to highlight the distinct experiences of refugee youth. There are many different immigration classes that people can come to Canada under, but the needs of refugees and the policy related to them is different to other immigration classes. And so it's incumbent on researchers to find out more and continue to delineate their distinct needs. Many of the participants in this research had come with their families to Canada under the refugee class. So this research talks a little bit more about their distinct experiences. Also, we know that when people come to Canada as refugees, those distinct needs that they experience are things like lower English levels, experiences of trauma in countries of origin before they arrive, and lower basic skills, maybe than people in other immigration classes. And that's all relevant then to their employment trajectories. So just to give you a bit of background about the methodology for this study, and I won't go through this slide in detail, I think what I want to pull out for practitioners here that they might find interesting is that you can see we did in-depth face-to-face interviews with 22 young people who participated in employment programs with a work placement element. Just to say that we had an operational definition of work placements as short-term, up to 3 months, planned workplace learning opportunities that were paid or unpaid, which involved the application of transferable skills and sampling of different careers. I'll tell you a little bit more about the programs who participated in the research later on. But just to say, there are 2 particular tools that we used when we talked to young people that seemed to be of value to the research and also potentially valuable to practitioners. One was an imagination exercise where we asked young people to sit down and map out their most successful work experience, to vision that and what it could look like, either by bullet point or by drawing it or whatever way they wanted to, and then to map the different supports that they felt that they would need before, during, and after those work placements, either from themselves, employers, or programs that would help them bring that most successful work experience or work placement into being. And young people really reflected that they enjoyed that method very much, that it allowed them to critically reflect on past experience and really vision the future. And it was a valuable tool. The other thing that we did is we used a benefits checklist to allow youth to isolate the kind of benefits they felt that they experienced from the work placement element of their programs. So we gave them a list of benefits, and those benefits were drawn from the literature. The top 5 there were drawn from literature around the kind of competencies that young people should have in terms of for fostering employability. And then the integration benefits are ones that are drawn from the literature around what constitutes successful integration upon arrival to Canada or in terms of settlement into Canada. The benefits checklist was good because it allowed us to, I suppose, go back and talk to youth about benefits that they hadn't necessarily experienced or talked about in their narratives of work placements, and just to get a sense of what the priority outcomes or benefits were for all the youth that we spoke with. The idea being that we recommend, and you'll see later on, that this benefits checklist might form a foundation for the development of evaluations of work placement elements for employment programs. So who were the youth participants in the study? Again, I'm not going to go through all of the data in this table, but what I'd like to do is refer to how the table illuminates some of the barriers that young people were facing in terms of the 22 people that we talked to. You can see there that the average age in the group was 22. The youngest age of arrival was 10, and the eldest was 24, with the median age at 17. This tells us that many of our participants arrived in Canada at a later stage, in a late age. And this plays a role, I suppose, in the literature particularly. It's shown to play a role in language acquisition, which then has an impact on career preparation and employment. We can also see there that, as already talked about, there are a number of young people who participated who came to Canada with their families as refugees. And you can also see that there are relatively low education levels in the group. So many were still in school, and that's another piece of this research that's interesting, is that some of the youth were in school and some were out of school. In-school youth generally were doing their work placements as part of their credits for high school, and they were generally like doing short-term work placements from 1 to 3 weeks that were unpaid. You can see that some are somewhere, then the rest were out of school, and this means that they were generally doing work placements as a result of life skills and employability programs that involved some payment through wage subsidy. But what you can see there is that very few have post-secondary education, and this is also a barrier that is faced often by this group, particularly around interrupted and lengthened educational trajectories, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Just to say then, you get a sense of the kind of program engagement that we had. PAUSE is Paving a Way for Success. It's an in-school program, and you can see 7 participants came through that program, and the others came from a variety of employment programs. Skills Link is one, in particular a program called Kaleidoscope, which fosters employability skills through learning about film and TV production. And then there were 2 other programs, Moving Ahead and Job Options, and these are MOSAIC programs, as is the PAUSE program. Just to give you a breakdown of the employers that we talked to, we talked to 5 nonprofit employers, 2 retail, 2 film and TV production, 1 recruitment agency, and 1 healthcare service provider. So what did we hear from young people? What I thought I would do now is just present you with a couple of snapshots of some of the young people that we talked to, so you could get a sense of their stories and also the kind of key themes that came up throughout the narratives that young people told us about their work placements. So the first one here is Salmon, and by the way, these are different names. We asked youth to choose a different name to use in case we wanted to present quotes or snapshots. So this is Salmon. Salmon is 21 years old, and he came to Canada as a refugee. You can see there that he dropped out of high school. So he was put in high school upon arrival, but then he actually left because his peers were a lot younger than him. He'd been moved back in years. He had to repeat some schooling already completed. And this is something that we found quite often with the young people that we interviewed, that they had to repeat schooling or that they'd had kind of interrupted educational journeys. He did a 5-week work placement in post-production, which he described as really, really positive. He reports being immersed in the whole process of post-production and being given a significant amount of responsibility very soon after he started the placement. He said that in terms of the support offered, he had one consistent supervisor and work buddy, and he really did feel that the work placement had contributed to his integration into Canada through 2 different themes that were often talked about by young people in their narratives of work placement. That the work placements were good because they were treated like part of the team, and also because they were treated like a Canadian. And very often youth actually said that they were treated like a Canadian in their work placements, and this aided their integration. He describes this being treated like a Canadian as, because I feel, quote, because I feel that I'm part of that now without them seeing or checking, because they never ask or treat me like I'm from country of origin, or I'm not Canadian, or I'm not one of them, unquote. He is now, at time of interview, he was working at 2 part-time jobs, planning to study film at Capilano and making a short film with his peers for Sundance Film Festival, and credits those outcomes to the work placement experience. The next story I want to present is Michelle's story. Michelle came to Canada at the age of 24 under the skilled worker dependent class. She also did a 5-week work placement which involved data collection and database organization. She says that she had a very positive work placement experience, and that she's still in contact with the supervisor at her work placement, which was atypical for most youth that we had spoken with, but something that they valued. Her story highlights themes of how work placements develop language confidence for young people, foster community connection, and also describe the work placement as an intermediate step towards other goals, towards their longer-term career goals. She says that the work placement helped her to challenge herself to break out of the restaurant industry that she felt she was stuck in, and to foster her English confidence. But what's interesting is that ultimately, while she credits the work placement that she did with a desire and a motivation to gain what she called a professional job, she needed to progress into another employment program to finally secure the full-time employment that she's in, which is in the IT industry, which is what she's qualified for. So that just gives you a sense of the stories that young people told us. And now what I want to do is just give you a little bit more detail about the findings of the research. So what did the findings of the research, and again, this was a small-scale study, it was exploratory, so these are not representative findings or can't be generalized to all immigrant and refugee youth. But what did it tell us about the employment barriers that young people face? First, and I think the one thing that I'd like to really focus on there, oh, sorry, I think I have, sorry, I skipped ahead a slide, let me go back. Sorry. What do the findings of the research tell us about the expectations for and experience of work placements for the people that we talked to, the young people we talked to? First of all, that it was a successful element of the programs that they did. All the young people indicated a very high level of satisfaction with their work placements. They enjoyed the work. They said they actually really enjoyed the sampling of many different tasks while they were doing work placements, as opposed to being placed in one role and working to that one role. The outcomes that they seemed to value the most were the development of English skills, also employment, as half the sample indicated that they got employment as a result of their work placements, not necessarily with the employers they did the placements with, but they felt their labor market attachment could be attributed to the work placement. They also fostered community connection. They allowed people to connect in with and get to know the local areas that they live in. The work placements provided skills for field of interest in terms of where young people felt they wanted to end up in terms of their career development, and provided valuable Canadian experience. And these are the outcomes that young people valued. Also, you could tell from the results of the benefits checklist that the work placements did foster transferable skills for young people and aided their integration. One thing I'd like to say here is around the awareness of young people's services, like the employment programs through which work placements were done. Many of the young people that we talked to said that they were so delighted to find these types of opportunities because they, A, were not available potentially in their country of origin, or were too expensive to avail of in their country of origin. This tells us a little bit then maybe potentially why young people may not be using those services, and may point to some work that needs to be done around raising their awareness of these types of programs and elements of them. And now on to the barriers. What does the research tell us then about the barriers that young people are facing around employment? You can see there's a whole list of them there. I just want to focus on one that I haven't touched on yet, which is around the lack of effective bonding and bridging social capital, and tell you a little bit about what that means. Basically, we see in this group a lack of what's called bridging capital, which means connections outside their ethnocultural communities to access things like labor market information, references for jobs, mentoring, and actual employment. And so some of the youth in this study did really talk about how, particularly around parental support, how they couldn't call on parental support because parents didn't have what they themselves didn't have what youth needed in terms of this kind of bridging capital to help them with their employment. Also then, we also saw the lack of bonding capital as well, which is access to labor market attachment within community, and that came up during the research. I think that's all I'll focus on in terms of barriers. I think what's also interesting, though, is that around the barriers, when we interviewed employers, we did find that there could be space for educating employers on the full range of barriers that young people face around employment, immigrant and refugee youth. Employers were very likely to say that they felt the barriers that young people face were lack of English and lack of Canadian experience. But as you can see there, there's a whole other set of barriers that could be useful for employers to know about, as they may have an impact on the young person's functioning in the workplace. What did our findings tell us about the career development of immigrant and refugee youth that we talked to? We could tell from the findings that all of the youth had high educational and career aspirations. The majority planned to continue their education, and they had career goals that required post-secondary education, but it wasn't clear how they were going to access support to do that. One of the things we heard back from program staff when we talked to them was that funder emphasis on employment and having that as an outcome from programs challenges the program focus on longer-term career development. So where there are fewer targets for continuing education versus gaining attachment, it can make it difficult then to work with young people to foster longer-term plans where employment is at the end of a post-secondary qualification. The other thing, anecdotally, that we documented through the research was that due to funding cuts, there are some skills links programs that may not be offering work placement as a result in the future, and yet we've seen from this piece of research that work placements are a successful element. The other point that's important there is that parents are important to this group of young people's employment journeys and career development, potentially more so than Canadian-born youth, as some youth did report on familial obligations to work and or trying to live up to familial expectations around the career trajectories that they should take. Findings around program supports and employer engagement. Some of these are relevant to any target group, but we did document that potentially employers could increase their capacity in relation to placement supports, particularly around providing things like pre-placement interviews, exit interviews, having work buddies for young people to be paired with during work placements, and developing role specifications, as many of the employers that we talked to didn't have these supports in place for work placements. We also felt there that employers could benefit from an understanding of how hosting youth contributes to workplace diversity, and that programs themselves could harness this as a way to promote work placements for immigrant and refugee youth they're working with. Few employers were likely to say that having youth from immigrant and refugee communities come into their workplaces could help them to do things like better reflect their customer base, attract in new customers, things like that. And so that would be a way to promote the value of these placements for the target group. In terms of recommendations, for programs in particular, so for practice, obviously to continue to provide placements as they were documented to be successful through this small-scale research. that the benefits checklist could be used as a foundation to develop evaluations of the work placement elements of employment programs. Also, that involving parents would be really important. That could be just having discussions about parents' role in the career development of this particular target group, or actually bringing parents into employment programs, bringing them into meetings with program workers, or maybe meeting with them separately as a group, but that you need to factor them in somehow. Find work placements for young people that maximize English confidence, skills for field of interest, fit to cultural background, okay? And also see how connection to mentors could be fostered through the work placements. So ongoing development of bridging capital for young people through work placements, through mentorship. That you could promote workplace diversity, and as well as the existing special skills of youths to potential host employers. And that's one thing I forgot to mention in the profile of participants, is that many youth said that they arrived to Canada with special skills that they had already developed from previous work experience. So it's a way to promote this, them to employers, to take them on for work placements. We did recommend that programs could deepen employer engagement, that they could, I suppose, just take a look at the frequency of communication with employers, inviting employer input into the content of preparation for work placements, and look at more demand-led approaches where possible and appropriate. And then lastly, in terms of recommendations, this has already been mentioned, but just around tailoring the work placement to English level, really ensuring an adequate opportunity to interact with customers and other staff. So if language level is beginner, then maybe it's more backroom, but lots of interaction with staff. And if English is more advanced, then customer facing and offering that chance to practice English. And also encouraging future English training if they feel that the young person needs it. Also, applying the job search skills that they learn in programs to the acquisition of the placement could be beneficial. And also the development of a longer-term action plan for youth that factors in any other education that they might need to achieve in order to get to their longer-term career goals. And this can be done within the program or within the context of case management at Work BC centres. And so it's important as well, I guess, to really emphasize and encourage to young people to move into that service provision post the placement. And just some partners that we want to thank there.
Thanks, Natasha. We'll have a few minutes to have some discussion around this presentation before we turn it over to McCreary, but so I encourage our audience out there to use that questions feature in your dashboard to pose your questions to Natasha. Maybe I'll start with a question. You covered both paid and unpaid work placements. Did you notice or did you find any differences in the kinds of benefits that either one provided?
Thanks, John. That's a great question. And actually, I meant to mention that we really couldn't see any difference in terms of benefits achieved and or enjoyment of work placement based on whether they were paid or unpaid. Yeah.
Well, maybe while we're still waiting, I'll ask another one. I have lots of questions today. You spoke about employer engagement. Maybe you can speak a little more specifically about what practitioners can do to support employer capacity to support these kinds of work placements. Is there anything that you found from either talking to employers or to youth themselves or practitioners about what specifically could be done?
Well, I think there's those two key points just around how you promote the value of the work placement, particularly around workplace diversity and the special skills that youth have already developed. I know that programs work very hard to engage employers, and I think that it's maybe just to continue that. And I think one of the other recommendations that we had was a toolkit for employers around providing work placements to the cohort, which could, I suppose, incorporate useful templates around those kind of supports that we said that we didn't often necessarily hear employers providing, like pre-placement interviews, exit interviews, kind of things to have in place for the young person. But sorry, just to say, yeah, inviting employer input, I think, into work placement preparation design, I think is another way to do that.
Thanks. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but it's always great to hear some of these practical recommendations. Okay, well, we'll still have a few minutes at the end of the next presentation if you think of any further questions for Natasha. But now I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie and Annie of McCreary Center Society.
Hi there, this is Stephanie here. I'm here with Annie. As was said in the beginning, McCreary works in the area of youth health through research, evaluation, and youth engagement projects. And this project that we're presenting today aim to engage diverse youth from marginalized populations to identify barriers to employment and solutions to youth unemployment. So I'll just say thanks to the BC Centre for Employment Excellence for funding this and for having us here today. So I'll first give a little bit of background about the project and the participants, and then I'll talk about the barriers the young people we spoke with described in finding and maintaining employment. And then Annie's going to talk about the supports that they found helpful and share some of their suggestions to improve employment opportunities for youth in BC. So 150 youth between the ages of 15 and 29 took part in the project. We initially aimed to speak with 50 young people, and we just had an overwhelming response from both the service organizations that we approached and the young people who they invited to participate. I think this topic is something that the service organizations found was really important, regardless of what type of service they were providing to young people. And for the youth themselves, they had a lot to say about it. So the majority took part in a focus group and filled out a survey as part of that focus group. And then in order to ensure people who weren't able to attend those were able to participate, we did do a few individual interviews, and young people were invited to fill out the survey online. So the findings that we're going to be sharing are from both the surveys and the focus groups. This is a little bit of background of the participants from the surveys. We visited 12 communities across the province, and this included an urban community and a rural community, at least one of each from each of the province's 5 health authority regions. Around 2/3 of the young people who participated came from urban communities. The greatest number were from Vancouver Coastal, followed by the North, and then about an equal number from Interior Fraser and Island. So in addition to diversity in ages and regions of the province, we aim to engage young people with diverse backgrounds and experiences. We found that 19% of the young people who completed the survey identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. 50% identified as Aboriginal. Over half of the young people had experience of homelessness, and over half of the young people had been in government care at some point in their lives. Another 23% of youth had been in a youth custody center at some point, and 64% identified having at least one health condition or disability. So you can just get a bit of a picture with this of some of the other things going on in young people's lives that might be affecting their employment and schooling experiences. So among the young people who had a health condition or disability, most identified having more than one. 17% identified having 4 or more. The most common of these was a mental health condition, which 46% of young people indicated on the survey. We also asked about young people's schooling experiences, and among those young people who were not currently attending school, around half had stopped attending before graduating from high school. In the focus groups, a lot of people also shared experiences of frequently changing schools or having long gaps in their attendance because of other factors going on in their lives. Participants had quite a lot of experience with different jobs. 84% had held at least one job, but participants most commonly had had 5 or more. 40% were currently employed at the time of the focus groups or the surveys, and among these youth, most indicated working 13 to 20 hours a week. Older young people were generally more likely to have had a job for a year or more, but most of the young people had worked at their job for less than 12 months. 62% had been at their job for less than 12 months. The survey asked about the barriers young people experienced accessing employment, and this graph shows some of the most common responses. 45% of young people indicated transportation challenges. 41% not having the needed skills or education, and 36% a lack of job availability in their communities. We got into more detail about each of these in the focus groups, so the next few slides will share some of that feedback. Transportation was a huge challenge, and this was in every community, both urban and rural. This included things like a lack of available or affordable public transportation, including the hours, and not having a driver's license as well. Barriers around skills and qualifications included needing a GED, or in some cases even having a grade requirement to finish grade 10 to get into training programs. And also not having all of the qualifications needed for a position. So often people described experiences where they might have had 4 or 5 of the qualifications needed, but there was one outstanding, and they might have to wait, 6 months until the next intake into a program where they could gain that qualification. One of the things that came up again and again, which we weren't entirely expecting from the get-go, was needing strong interpersonal skills. This was one of the areas we talked about the most. People talked about how anxiety around approaching employers or being evaluated in an interview had led them to decide against applying for a job that they felt that they were qualified for. Discrimination was also an issue, particularly for LGBT youth, Aboriginal youth, and youth with disabilities. Other barriers included needing identification to apply for a job, or even things like having a phone number or an address. So particularly for those young people who were unstably housed, they talked about trying to decide if they should put an address of a shelter that they're staying at, and being worried that that would mean they wouldn't be called in for an interview, things like that. Other barriers included accessing job postings, so either not knowing where to look, not having access to the internet, or not feeling comfortable completing applications online. And that came up quite a bit. I think we sometimes assume that young people are really comfortable on the internet, but a lot of young people had difficulties navigating some of the websites that job postings were on, or not feeling able to complete the online applications by themselves and wishing they could really go in and make an impression in person. Youth also talked about a lack of accessible employment programs due to things like long wait lists or restrictions, for example, being too young or needing to be a student to be eligible for jobs. Some of the barriers which presented particular challenges for some groups of youth included childcare responsibilities or a lack of affordable childcare. This limited some young people's ability to travel for work or their availability for shifts, especially for young people in care or those young people who didn't have a strong extended support network. Youth with government care experience also talked about a range of challenges, such as not having an adult in their life who had modeled employment skills, the need to be financially independent, getting in the way of school, so they may have left school in order to earn an income, and requirements around school and work that came with being on a youth agreement. Poverty was a major barrier for many youth. Some of the challenges associated with this were not being able to afford things like tools or uniforms, or even just not having like a big nutritious lunch if young people were going out to be working a labor job all day. Some young people had experienced physical restrictions due to a health condition or disability. Others described cognitive challenges that made it difficult to do things like picking up and remembering new tasks. Youth also talked about how their peer group affected their motivation to find work. For example, youth whose peers were criminally involved talked about how this had lowered their motivation to find legal work. And knowing that they had the option to earn an immediate income through illegal means of employment, it made it more difficult for them to break out of the networks, particularly when they were facing really big hurdles due to having a criminal record or a reputation in their community for criminal involvement. And this was often even more of a barrier in rural communities. Another barrier specific to rural communities was having to choose between leaving family to find work or staying home without job prospects. Many of the same barriers were cited in terms of maintaining employment. Motivation continued to be a challenge after youth started a job. They felt that entry-level jobs could be tedious, which I'm sure some of us have experienced with, and many were having to get into the habit of getting up and being on time for work every day. And something that stood out to me was that a lot of young people hadn't had this experience. They didn't get this experience through school because they had spotty attendance. So it was really the first time that they were having to develop those skills to, be on time and keep their schedule when their shifts might be changing every week. Changing shifts were an issue, so were low wages, incompatible school and work schedules, particularly if young people were having to work 2 or more part-time jobs. Other young people experienced a long commute, which made it difficult to get to work, or they found it difficult to afford their transportation. Some young people had to rely on their coworkers for work if they didn't have public transport or their own vehicles. One young person we spoke to described often being let go from her shift early. She was working in the restaurant business, and if they didn't have enough customers, she would be let go early, which meant that she couldn't carpool with her employer. So she would have to take a cab home, which would be the majority of her earnings from that shift. Again, relationships with coworkers was really key. Many young people felt that a lack of communication and conflict resolution skills had led them to leave a job. We also had a lot of discussion around anger management and how to manage frustrations, and young people feeling like they didn't really have the skills to be able to manage this constructively. Racism and other types of discrimination were also issues on job sites, as was sexual harassment, and that was described as coming from both coworkers, supervisors, and customers. Many young people felt that a lack of training and unsafe work conditions had put them at risk. People described situations where there were rules in place, but they felt there was an unwritten kind of rule that people wouldn't follow these in order to finish their tasks on time. This pressure was often compounded by high competition for jobs, particularly in regions where a lot of jobs were seasonal. Young people felt that employers could find workers who would be willing to work and do the jobs if they were to complain about it. So I'll pass it over to Annie now, who's going to talk about some of the supports and suggestions.
Thank you. So once we'd established the kind of barriers, we asked young people, both on the survey and in the interviews, what had actually helped them to get a job. And you can see the results from the survey there. And the number one thing that had helped young people was actually kind of relationships. So somebody they knew worked somewhere and got them in, or somebody they knew was prepared to give them a chance. And it's a bit misleading that the second kind of most common response on the survey was getting help write a CV, because young people on the survey could kind of mark all that apply that had been helpful. And when we actually drilled down into this in the focus groups, young people said that yes, it was helpful when they could put together a good CV, but they were really frustrated when that was all that programs offered them. So if they went to an employment program, they were hoping for way more than just help putting their CV together. The other sort of supports I'll kind of go into in a bit more detail. But also on the survey, we asked young people who had been able to maintain employment what had happened. And the second most common reason, so for 69%, getting along well with their co-workers was what had helped them to keep the job. And again, this is kind of, I'm going to talk a bit more about this, and also Steph pulled that out as the major barrier not being able to get along with people, which certainly was not kind of what we anticipated being one of the major messages to come out of this report. So we asked young people for their suggestions to increasing access to employment, and kind of one of the key things was the need for really individualized and youth-focused supports. For example, they didn't want to go to employment programs that also served adults. They didn't want young people and adults mixed together. They talked about the need for flexible employment programs, so not just focused specifically on the job finding, but also things like helping young people to get identification if they didn't have that, and also offering different services for youth with different challenges. And I'll talk in a minute about some of the evaluated programs that we looked at. We were able to sort of look in a bit more detail at some programs that had been evaluated, and they were really focused on the ones that were successful, focused on one target group of young people. So, for example, gang-involved young people or young people with a disability, things like that. So not kind of assuming all young people are the same and putting them into one program. Young people also really picked out financial support as key in terms of things like employment programs that supported them to buy uniforms if they were going to need a uniform, would help them with transportation, either by giving them a lift or giving them access to bus tickets and things like that. And programs like Blade Runners, which also gives young people living expenses to help them sort of during that time. Again, the need to teach interpersonal skills. People talked a lot about maybe not even going for an interview if they were successful in getting one because they had no idea kind of what questions they would be asked, how they should go about answering them, what to wear, and then beyond the interview, sort of developing skills to actually be able to hold a job, deal with customers, talk to co-workers. They also talked about the gap. A lot of these young people had been through alternate education programs or had had kind of really checkered school histories, and they didn't feel that they'd been taught the skills that they need within school that they could take into employment. So there was an example of a school in the interior that had a catering program that didn't just teach young people to cook, but actually kind of created a kitchen atmosphere that would recreate what they got when they actually got in the workforce. So things like that would be sort of really helpful in developing those skills. A lot of young people didn't feel that the jobs that were advertised were targeting them, so they suggested things like advertising at lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender events to let young people know that they would be welcome into the workforce and that the jobs that were being advertised were available to them. And then kind of building on Steph's point about the problems with dealing with things like youth agreement, they wanted agencies to work collaboratively together. So, for example, linking assistance and MCFD if they were sort of managing the youth agreements and the employment programs so that young people knew what they could get involved in, what effect this might have on their benefits, and be able to sort of work around that. In terms of the suggestions for being able to keep a job, because for many of them getting the job wasn't the issue, it was keeping it. They suggested providing transition services, which would not only help young people from school into their first job, but would stay involved through their early years in the job market. Often young people were not going to be staying at the first job they got, they were going to be trying a few. So they were hopeful that there would be some transition services that would help them with that. Again, the need for more interpersonal skills so they could work through issues with customers, co-workers, employers as they came up. We spoke to a number of young people who had kind of just walked away from a job or from a situation because they didn't know how to handle it. If somebody could help them to deal with those conflicts as they arose. Also the need for life skills, things like being able to do their laundry, to keep their uniforms clean, being able to budget when they were getting a wage. And real practical things like young people not having an alarm clock if they didn't have a phone or anything and needing assistance with things like that. They also suggested it would be really helpful. Many of them were in entry-level, very low-wage jobs. If funding was available to help them to upgrade their skills while they were working so that they could see that there was kind of going to be career progress ahead. And then they felt also that employers should be trained about the challenges that young people face. So, for example, if they had a learning disability and learnt by modelling, that the employer would know that when the young person went along and could work with them accordingly. So I mentioned earlier about the evaluated case studies. So we asked young people across the province to pick out sort of programs that exemplified their suggestions in which they'd had experience that was really good. And 5 kind of came out very strongly from young people. So when we looked into that, actually only 2 of those had sort of been evaluated. But they had some key components which the evaluations had pulled out were particularly successful with young people. And these were reflected in all 5 of those programs. And these were that these programs offered financial and transportation support. So that definitely echoed what young people were telling us they needed. These programs provided individualized support from a mentor who would work one-on-one with youth while they were on a work placement and in the early part of their career. The programs all were not general. They focused on a specific group of youth, be they youth with mental health issues or youth who were gang involved, but they had a speciality. They addressed issues beyond employment, so they worked with young people around their substance use or other things that were going on in their life. They made a real effort to match the work placement to the young person's interest, and they did teach the softer skills, so the life skills and the interpersonal skills. And this is just from the survey as well. We noted that most youth had positive plans for the future. They were optimistic about finding employment and a career. And in the focus groups, they sort of talked about their plans for advanced education and specialist training. So despite all the barriers they're facing, most young people saw that they would be on a career path within a year, and 91% thought they would be there within 5 years. I think what was interesting was young people also saw themselves more likely to be employed in their own community within a year, but thought that they would probably have to move outside their community after that. So we kind of took young people's ideas and looked at the evaluated case studies and asked them kind of concretely to design a program if they were designing their sort of ideal employment support program. And what they came up with, and again what was supported by the case studies, was that the program will be kind of 6 to 12 months in duration. It would serve young people aged 15 to 24 with a bit of flexibility, but not much, certainly at the upper age range. Would provide a training wage and assistance with travel, equipment and clothing. Would provide a mentor or a key worker who would work with young people on their individual challenges and goals. Would offer additional support such as childcare or with learning modifications. Would offer concrete relevant employment skills and a realistic assessment of available jobs locally. So making sure that young people were getting trained in skills and things where there was actual employment opportunities locally. Again, the interpersonal skills came up again and again and again, need for training around that. The opportunity for young people to try things, not just be put into one opportunity, but to get some hands-on experience in a wide variety of areas to see what was a good fit for them. Opportunity for them to gain relevant qualifications, because as Steph said, it came up regularly that they might be short one thing, but they had to wait a year just to get on a course that would give them that, maybe to get into a trades program or something like that. And they definitely wanted help with resume writing, interview skills, and also how to apply those skills. Young people gave examples of where they'd been and kind of learned skills, but actually didn't know how they were transferable. Why is WorkSafe important? What do you do with your WMIS? Those kind of things. And they suggested that the ideal program would have really minimal entrance requirements and rolling admission dates so that young people didn't have to wait 6 months to get into a program. And they also put a real emphasis on who should work there, and they really felt that people were what made the programs. So they felt that staff at their ideal employment program would most definitely enjoy working with young people and sort of understand the issues that young people were going through. Would spend some time getting to know young people and who they were, what their interests were. Would be honest with youth, wouldn't kind of tell them that, they had the skills if they didn't, but would just kind of really honestly spell things out. Would have contacts with employers so that they could make those connections for young people. Would be skilled, so kind of trained to work with young people, and also non-judgmental in their attitude and approach. and would really put time into helping young people prepare for interviews rather than just kind of focusing on the CV end of things, and would go along with young people to those interviews to offer support and kind of some coaching along the way. So, you know, again, as I say, the people were considered to be one of the most important elements of the program. So just to sort of sum it all up then, vulnerable young people have to negotiate some pretty major barriers to employment, but with support we can see that young people are able to maintain employment and they have some definite career plans. And based on their experiences, they can identify what's working well in British Columbia, and they've got suggestions for how employment services might better meet their needs, and they've got some real concrete ideas about the sorts of programs which best do or could meet these needs. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie Annie. We'll have a few minutes for questions here, but maybe I'll kick it off again with a question of my own. I know that youth are really engaged with your study, and you had quite a good turnout for your quite a good response. I was wondering, one question would be what really was driving youth to speak to you about their experiences? What were some of the key factors that were prompting them to want to talk to you about it? And then secondly, have you engaged with practitioners at all about your research, and what might be some of the key factors that you've presented that you see as being easily or very quickly implementable, that's a word, something that practitioners can implement right away into their own work, into their own programming?
I'll just start to talk a little bit about the participants. I think we went to a range of different organizations to speak with young people. So we went to one of the youth custody centers. We did go to some employment programs. We also went to some alternate schools, youth drop-in centers. Well, whatever it was that the service was, I think that one of the central things that young people needed to or felt that they wanted to get in control of in their life was employment, and they felt that that was that they needed to get that working for them before everything else could get on track, or that was a key piece to getting where they wanted to be. So yeah, I think it was just so central to everything that was going on for them. It was one of the key struggles.
In terms of kind of engaging with practitioners, we haven't been out and done too much so far. We do have some additional webinars coming up that hopefully people will kind of tune into. And we made a commitment to the young people who took part in the focus groups that we would provide some sort of summary of and the agencies that helped us to kind of locate young people. We would provide a summary of the sort of recommendations and the work that had come out of young people. So we're just in the process of putting that together to send out, and we can make sure it's available to you as well. So.
Great. Okay, well that's excellent. Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for this for these very interesting presentations and this important work that you've completed. I should note that the McCreary paper is already available on our website, and the paper that Natasha presented by MOSAIC will be published later this afternoon. So I encourage you to download those pieces and dig deeper into this important work that they've completed. You will be receiving an email tomorrow with a link to the presentation and a video recording of today's event. Unfortunately, we have found that the system does not record those of you connecting only by phone as having attended. So you may be receiving an email saying that we're sorry that you are unable to attend. If that's the case and you would like confirmation of your attendance for accreditation purposes, please contact us at the address in the email, and then we can send you that confirmation. Part 2 of this series will take place in 2 weeks on September 24th. It will feature a presentation by the YMCA of Greater Vancouver on their research study that examined whether there's a common understanding of the barriers to employment facing youth living with mental illness among the youth themselves, those who provide them with services, and those who employ them. Please check our website for the registration link, and we really hope that you can join us. Well, that ends our event for today. On behalf of today's presenters and my colleagues at the Center, I'd like to thank you, and I hope you have a great afternoon.